Good morning, everyone. I see, just as everyone's trickling in, getting a morning cup of coffee, let's get started. Welcome back for day 2 of the Australian Political Studies Association 2013 conference. For those of you with which I'm not acquainted, my name's Jeffrey Wilson. I'm a fellow in the Asia Research Centre here at Murdoch University, and I'm going to be chairing our opening session this morning. Before we begin, I would like to wish you a warm welcome to a special guest we have, Miss Cynthia Griffin, the United States Consul General in Perth. The US Consulate General in Perth has supported this roundtable through its Cultural Grants Program, and we're particularly glad to have you with us here this morning. Now, the theme for the APSA conference this year is the politics of natural resources, and the organising group felt that running a roundtable would be an ideal way to bring together many of the strands of work that we're seeing on this theme. Issues to do with natural resource politics are ever present through the conference proceedings this year. We have a dedicated stream of panels for resource politics, though I'd also note that many of the other papers in some way pick up on some of these issues, particularly in the Australian politics and international relations streams. And what we're hoping to do with this roundtable this morning is to bring all of this research together in one place and have a critical and collective discussion amongst ourselves as to how the various dynamics in resource politics we're seeing in the contemporary world come together. So the topic that we've selected for this roundtable is governing the resources boom. And now, for those of you who are Australians in the audience, you might hear this topic selection and respond, it might elicit feelings of exhaustion or despair, because for all the uncertainty we've had in Australian political life over the last 6 or so years, the resource boom has really been one of the constants in the national political discourse. In Australia, the resource boom has been elevated to almost having these mythic proportions. On the one hand, the factor that saved Australia from the worst ravages of the global financial crisis, whilst on the other, posing these problems with the so-called two-speed economy. But the resource boom is really not an Australian phenomenon, but a global phenomenon, and it's also caught the attention of international audiences. On the one hand, some have argued that it's driving an economic renaissance in many resource-rich developing countries, particularly in Africa, while on the other, a lot of governments, NGOs and international organisations have become increasingly concerned with its effects on resource security, good governance, corruption and issues to do with social justice. Now, importantly, economic forecasts tell us that, at least in the medium term, the resource boom is not going away, and it's likely to become a structural feature of the world economy for at least another decade. And this means that getting to grips with the resource boom is a matter of major importance for Australian political scientists of all subfield inclinations. Now, at its core, the global resource boom has a fairly simple cause: the success of economic development strategies across the developing world. Over roughly the last 2 decades, many developing countries have undergone a major economic transformation. They've successfully launched industrialisation through a transition from primary industries towards modern manufacturing and service sectors, while at the same time have rapidly promoted urbanisation, as millions of people have moved from rural areas to new cities. These processes have driven high-speed economic growth and contributed to the rise of the so-called global middle class. Now, notwithstanding the many environmental and societal challenges that this has posed, these are clearly positive trends. However, the success of these development strategies has in turn posed serious problems for the world's resource systems. Rapidly industrialising and urbanising economies consume huge amounts of natural resources. Minerals and energy to power industrial and construction sectors, and high-value food products increasingly demanded by wealthy middle-class consumers. And the problem, of course, is that global supply simply has failed to keep pace with demand. Global resource markets began an upwards march in the middle of the 2000s, around the year 2003 or 2004, and by the end of last year, the price of most energy, food and mineral products had increased between 3- and 5-fold on their levels only a decade earlier. International investment in resource industries has also surged as corporations have moved to capitalise on these record high prices. And particularly if we look at the global mining industry, mergers and acquisitions in this industry roughly doubled over the second half of the last decade. The distributional impacts of the global resource boom have been very uneven, as some groups have clearly benefited while others have arguably suffered. The main beneficiaries, of course, have been groups that are involved in the production of natural resources in some way. High prices means high profits for companies in the resource sector, and by extension benefits for individuals, communities and nations that can get a cut of the action. The Australian economy, and in particular that of the resource-rich states of Western Australia and Queensland, have been one of the big winners, and Australia's national primary industry exports almost tripled over the last decade to $184 billion per year. But it's also carried benefits across a range of resource-rich countries, with countries as diverse as Guinea, Indonesia, Brazil, Mongolia and Canada all enjoying their own resource-driven economic booms. Notwithstanding questions about how resource rents should be used and distributed, high resource prices have generally meant more investment, more jobs, and importantly more tax revenues for many governments around the world. But on the other hand, there's been a number of losers as well. Consumers of natural resources get stuck footing the bill for these high prices, and this is posing a major threat to the resource security of many countries. In our region of the world, many resource-poor Asian countries are instead not looking at this as a resource boom, but they refer to it as the resource crisis, as they struggle to pay for their surging energy import bills. And even within resource-rich countries, many disadvantaged social groups, in particular the urban poor, have seen poverty rates rise as household incomes are increasingly consumed by soaring food prices. Environmental issues have clearly become more important as growing resource production places ever and ever greater and largely unsustainable ecological demands on water and land resources and the communities that rely upon these. And we also have to remember that there are also intra-country debates over whom should get the lion's share of resource rents. And we see this in debates between local communities and broader societies, between governments and businesses, and even between those speaking for present and future generations, as humanity struggles to resolve questions around appropriate and equitable environmental discount rates. What this demonstrates is that the resource boom has distributional impacts. For some groups it's an opportunity, and for others a crisis. And as a consequence, we're seeing increasing levels of contestation over resource governance, as the involved actors negotiate, argue and compromise over how the costs and benefits should be distributed. We're seeing this at the local level, where local communities, who often benefit the least from resource extraction, are increasingly demanding a greater share of the economic rents from companies and governments. We're also seeing it at the international level, where consumer and producer countries have become locked in diplomatic stoushes over who should get access to resources from whom, on whose terms, and at what price. We're also seeing this at the government business level, in the rise of so-called resource nationalism, where governments are making increasingly onerous and tough regulatory demands on resource corporations in exchange for legal access to publicly owned natural resources. What unites all of these contests over resource governance is that they embody debates over how its benefits and costs should be distributed. And so this poses to us a really important question. How can we set up arrangements that efficiently and fairly share the costs and benefits of the resource boom between different social groups, between business and society, and between producing and consuming nations? Or, to put it another way, how can we equitably govern the resource boom? So this is the question that we'll be discussing in our roundtable this morning. Now, at this point in the proceedings, please let me introduce our 5 roundtable panellists. I must say that this is a very esteemed international group, many of whom have travelled over land and sea and suffered delays in airports and torrential storms to get here. So please let me extend our collective welcome to our speakers. I'll start at the far end. Our first is Professor Sean Breslin of Warwick University. Sean specialises in the political economy of contemporary China, and I hope should be familiar to us all after his highly engaging keynote yesterday morning on China's perspective on energy and security. Second, we have Professor Ronnie Lipschutz of the University of California, Santa Cruz. Ronnie specialises in global political economy with a particular focus on energy, resource and sustainability issues. And we would particularly like to thank the US Consulate General in Perth, and in particular Ms Griffin, for making Ronning's attendance possible through a cultural grant. Third, we have Ms Sarah Hooper from the Chamber of Mines and Energy of Western Australia. Sarah oversees the CME's portfolio areas of tax, people strategies, training, media and membership. And prior to her current post, she also had a distinguished foreign affairs career in government, having served in the Commonwealth Public Service, as well as in diplomatic posts in Indonesia and India. Fourth, we have Serena Lillywhite of Oxfam Australia. Serena's Oxfam's Mining Advocacy Coordinator, and her recent work has been particularly engaged with issues to do with corporate social responsibility and multinational mining corporations. And finally, we have Professor Peter Vale of the University of Johannesburg. Amongst a variety of Peter's research interests, he's a specialist in the politics and security of Southern Africa, which is an increasingly important area for global resource governance. Now, the structure for the roundtable this morning will be fairly relaxed and pretty straightforward. First, what I'm going to do is give all of our panellists an opportunity to get the discussion started by posing them a short question about a pertinent issue to do with resource governance relevant to their particular areas of expertise. Our panellists will address these questions in turn with a brief response, probably around 5 minutes or so, and once we've collected their views, we'll open up to the floor for around 40 minutes of open discussion, question and answer. So, with no further ado, let's begin. In no particular order, I'll start by turning over to Sean, if that's possible. And now, Sean, the global resource boom is, to a significant extent, a China-driven phenomenon, particularly the processes of industrialisation and urbanisation, which have been running at a very high pace in China for the last 2 decades. Building on the kind of analysis that you discussed yesterday, in what way does China's perspective on resource security and resource governance accord with what we've seen taken by other parties around the world? Government, companies, and possibly even civil society groups.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm pretty bored with listening to myself, so I'm sure you are as well, so I'll be very, very quick. Somebody asked a very interesting question yesterday about the difference between facts and data. So, to avoid the pitfall, I'm going to start with an anecdote. Take that as it is. Earlier this year, University of Warwick organised a seminar in Beijing where we got together a group of African ambassadors to China to not ask what does China want from Africa, but to say, what do you want from China? And I think the most important consequence was I got to ride in the Guinean ambassador's car through Beijing, not stopping at traffic lights, waved through. It was the greatest moment of my academic career so far. Downhill from there, I would have thought. And what they spoke about was the Makona River Development Zone, and this is a project that's been put forward by Liberia, Sierra Leone and Guinea, to varying degrees of enthusiasm, I have to say. And what they're looking for is the creation of a new development zone, but they don't know what's in that development zone, and there's no links within that development zone. So the first thing that they're looking for is somebody to come along and do some prospecting. And then if they do find something, to build the infrastructure which will connect the 3 countries together and also then into the global economy. And of course you can probably guess where they're looking for the source of help to do that. And this is a project that they're going into with their eyes open. They know there's a cost, and the cost is a certain percentage of any of the resources that are found and then are delivered by the Chinese built roads and ports into the global economy will have to go to Chinese companies. They also accept that Chinese companies along the road will be doing most of the construction, bringing in Chinese workers, sourcing materials back in China. And this is perhaps slightly off-piste from the way you intended it to go, but if we're talking about governing resource boom, I think actually what China has done is really fudged a lot of the boundaries between different areas of governance, because it's not just governance of resources, but this is governance of global aid. It's fundamentally changing the way that global aid or economic relationships that have aid and development consequences are being delivered. According to the Financial Times, admittedly through not the most robust methodology, in 2009-2010 China delivered more development aid than the World Bank. Most of this through the Export-Import Bank or the China Development Bank, and most of it with some element of resource, either directly into resource projects or loans that will be repaid partly in resources. And what we have is a situation where China is not a member of the DAC, of the OECD, It doesn't provide data that conforms with the DAC, and much of what is given by Chinese agencies is not considered to be aid. And yet a lot of it has aid and development consequences for the recipient country, and a lot of it is bound in with this desire to get hold of resources. A lot of it is projects initiated by Chinese companies that benefit the Chinese company, but also then have development consequences in Africa, Latin America, the rest of the region, which have resource consequences. And the reason I bring this up is because I think there's been a large expectation in a lot of the development world that China will eventually come along and sort of adopt Western standards. It will become more like us, if I can put the us in inverted commas. I'm really not so sure. I mean, there has been an increase in what we might call traditional Chinese aid, schools, education, partly as a response to some of these criticisms. But while the requirement for resources continues in China, whilst Chinese companies facing intense competition at home see going overseas and getting involved in these aid development loan projects as an important way of making money, while countries in Latin America, Caribbean and the rest of Asia and Western Australia are keen to sell their resources to fund this Chinese boom, I think we have to start rethinking a whole range of different ways in which we think about not just governance, but how we define some of the basic things that we've been treating as givens in international relations for a number of years. And it's notable that not only is China not a member of the DAC, it's not a member of the International Energy Agency either. And so I think we have to think very carefully about governance in the future, of whether we're just going to simply wait for countries like China to become normal, wait for them to adapt and adopt normal standards of behaviour and accounting and deliverance, or whether we have to start to think a bit more radically about agencies and institutions that are going to reflect the way that China and India and other countries want to do things rather than the way that we've done things in the past. So I think I spoke long enough yesterday, and hopefully that's been provocative enough for now, so I'm going to leave it at that.
Excellent. Here we go. Thanks very much for that, Sean. Now, I'll just turn to Serena next, if that's possible. Now, the NGO sector's really... There we go. The NGO sector's really been one of the major players in resource governance over the last couple of years. Within countries, you've seen a lot of development and governance-focused NGOs playing a major role in promoting social and environmental agendas into the policy-making process, which may not otherwise be articulated. And if you then look at the international level, you see initiatives such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, which really solidify the role of NGOs in global resource governance by making them a key actor at the table. So, if I'd be able to ask, how does an NGO like Oxfam seek to ensure that the resource boom is genuinely benefiting communities in resource-rich areas?
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, the Noongar people, and pay my respect to their elders, both past and present. Oxfam's been involved in mining work for the last 15 years, and we've got a program that operates in East Asia, Southeast Asia, many of the countries of Africa and South America. And I guess one of the key things that we've learned from that experience is that we're not going to be able to change the governance systems one mine at a time. If you like, adopting a more traditional advocacy approach of really delving deeply into what are the problems at each mine site and trying to tackle it that way. We need systemic change in order to address the sorts of issues that we're discussing. Clearly, the extractive sector does have the potential to deliver economic prosperity to developing countries, but only if the regulatory system is robust and there are enough checks and balances in place to make sure that those communities that are being directly impacted by the extractive sector are getting a fair share of that resource wealth. In fact, we know from our work that 2/3 of the world's poorest people, in fact, live in countries that are rich in natural resources, but more often than not, those countries are characterised by poverty, by corruption and by conflict. And the upshot of that is that more often than not, the citizens of those countries are indeed not getting a fair share of their natural resource wealth. And in fact, in some circumstances, they're indeed worse off if they're in fact losing access to their land, their livelihoods are compromised, increasing issues around food security are playing out now, and of course also human rights violations, particularly with regards to women, and the presence of conflict associated with extractive projects is not uncommon. So in short, I guess this is what we refer to as the resource curse in all its worst forms. We also know that, for example, in the countries of Africa alone, there are currently about 250 Australian mining operations underway. And despite that, though, many of these resource-rich countries are in fact falling into some of the lowest global rankings in terms of economic growth. In 2010, for example, exports of minerals and oil and gas from Africa were worth roughly 7 times the value of international aid to the continent, and so that really goes to the issue that has just been touched on. From our perspective, we really see that the emphasis has got to be on strengthening the regulatory environment, and as it suggested, the NGO sector is playing an increasing role in this space. We're trying to ensure that communities and citizens are actually getting a fair share of their natural resource wealth. And the two, I guess, systemic ways that we think this can be best achieved, as opposed to, mine-by-mine approach, is really tackling the two key issues of corruption and tax justice. We see these as being the two critical areas that are most likely to deliver long-term systemic change in the area of resource governance. Improved transparency in the disclosure of revenue flows, including taxes, royalties, bonuses, licence and exploration fees, and indeed contracts, is going to help combat corruption. But not just that, it's also going to enable the citizens of these resource-rich countries to use that information to hold their own governments to account, to explain not only how much revenue is flowing in to their economy from the resource sector, but more importantly, why is it not being spent on essential services such as schools and roads and access to clean water? What we call in Oxfam policy speak, domestic resource mobilisation. So for us, that's really the key issue that needs to be tackled at the moment. There clearly is global momentum for improved transparency. Reference was made to the voluntary initiatives such as the EITI, and whilst that can deliver some of the sorts of information that we're seeking, in our view, it just doesn't have enough teeth. And we, for that very reason, are much more interested in supporting some of the other global developments that are emerging, such as mandatory disclosure requirements that have emerged in the US through the Dodd-Frank legislation, and also in the EU, the EU directive, which requires all oil, gas and mining companies listed on those security exchanges to disclose all payments they make to governments on a country-by-country and also project-by-project basis. In regards, and I should point out that it's not just the US and the EU. Other countries such as Norway, France, Italy and Canada have also indicated that they will be following those mandatory disclosure requirements. With regards to tax, just to comment on that, the recent OECD base erosion and profit shifting report has confirmed that the global tax system is broken. It just hasn't kept pace with the transnational nature of our global economy. And one of the issues of that is that as a result, through clever accounting, which enables tax minimisation and tax evasion, this means that effectively it's robbing some of the poorest countries of the world of the very revenue that they need in order to be able to address issues of poverty and indeed sustainable development. And just one example, the government of Zambia believes it's owed up to $1 billion in unpaid taxes from copper production, and it's reported that more than half of the copper that was exported from Zambia in 2008 was supposedly sent to the tax haven of Switzerland. But Swiss import data shows that no Zambian copper passed through that country. So this really, from our perspective, highlights the importance in terms of tax justice, of ensuring that taxes in the extractives, with regards to extractive sector, ensuring that tax is actually paid in the country where the operation takes place, as opposed to profits being shifted to low taxing jurisdictions. The G20 gives us a great opportunity to address some of these issues around tax, and Australia obviously has presidency in 2014, and Oxfam will be working hard to ensure that these sorts of issues are on the agenda. But it's not just around tax and corruption. There are a whole range of other issues in terms of governance that is already in place that just needs to be upheld. Companies need to uphold standards such as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the voluntary principles on human rights and the use of security personnel are just two examples of what can be done to address some of these issues. And the other point I'd like to make is that in terms of if we tackle the big issues like corruption and tax, then the other piece of this is ensuring that communities are directly involved in negotiations and project decision making around extractives from the very earliest stage. And we know from our work that that's not often the case, and we also know that more often than not, women are not consulted, women are left out of the negotiating process, they're left out of discussions on benefit sharing agreements, and if they were at the table, they may in fact be negotiating very different deals for how their resource revenues would be spent. We know they have an interest in longer term issues such as essential services, as opposed to perhaps negotiating a new land cruiser, which may be a higher priority for a village chief, for example. So just to conclude, from our perspective, the issue is really around tackling corruption and pursuing tax justice as a systemic way to ensure that resource-rich but poor countries get a fair share of their natural resource wealth. But it's not just around disclosing how much money is being paid, it's also then really around fiscal justice and ensuring that those revenues are well spent and are being spent in a way that's going to benefit all citizens to get a fair share of their resource wealth. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much for that, Serena. And it's a nice point to end on, to then to turn our attention to Peter here. Now, Peter, the resource boom has seen a real renewed international interest in the economies, at least in the African continent. On the one hand, we've seen talk that natural resource industries could be this way to reinvigorate and restart the development process in resource-rich African economies. Indeed, here in Western Australia, a few weeks ago hosted the Africa Down Under conference, where I spoke to a number of people there, and everyone was talking about Australian mining companies being in Africa, and this was such a good story. But on the other hand, the long history of mining and tropical agriculture in Africa really cautions against the assumption that growing resource exploitation is actually and necessarily going to bring wealth and development. So what kinds of effects, be they political, economic or social, are we seeing in African countries that have gone through this process of the resource boom over the last few years?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for inviting me. I think if political scientists are going to get interested in these matters, I should bring a warning from Africa. And I'm going to ask you to show the first cartoon, because if you're going to do this kind of work, here is the warning. It's a big question to be asked to deal with the whole of Africa. So what I'll do is try to talk in two different threads. The first is address the issue of the resource curse in Africa through the optic offered by the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the second is I'll turn to the events in my own country in the last year or so, which have been disrupted. The whole contractual bargain of the new South Africa has been eroded and corroded by events in the resource industry. So let me start first by saying, of course, resource extraction is the central issue that brought Africa into what we call the international. It drew the emerging continent into the idea that there was a world beyond Europe, and it's something which people in Australia understand. The quintessential example of this is the country that used to be called the Belgian Congo. Now, if there's a piece of essential literature that should be on the bedside, perhaps not the bedside, but certainly the table of every student who studies resource politics, it should be Adam Hochschild's book called Leopold's Ghost. It is an absolutely essential piece of reading because it not only shows the corruption, corrosion of European exploitation of Africa, but it also tells the story of how socially disruptive the process of resource extraction was at the end of the 19th century. And it came, of course, after several centuries of slavery. And this notion, this momentum, started by first slavery and then the events of around the extraction of rubber from the Congo, stand as the great sort of foundations for trying to understand these issues. The rise of global social movements, the kind of issue you've been talking about, which challenged race essentialism, began also in the Congo experience. This itself drove anti-colonialism and, of course, the global anti-apartheid movement. While this particular caravan, as we've just seen, has moved on, the issue of liberal mineral extraction continues in Africa in many places, as the chairman has said. And recently the celebration has been Mozambique, which is a truly beautiful country, which is at the edge of South Africa, and which we're now seeing as one of the new mining or mineral horizons. However, events in the Congo continue, and it makes a regular appearance, the Congo makes a regular appearance in the annual failed state index, which comes from this magazine, Foreign Policy, which should be regarded as a kind of soft porn international relations. The most recent copy, which I picked up in Amsterdam Airport about a week ago, the most recent copy carries an article on the Democratic Republic of Congo, written by two. I'm going to choose this word very carefully because I consulted an Australian friend, and he said it has a particular meaning, by two plonkers, Jeffrey Herbst and Greg Mills, who have written an article in which they claim, which stands as a kind of quintessential example of the approach of two people who have dedicated 20 or 25 years to ending the state in favor of the market. And they have two claims in here which are really important. The first claim is, isn't it time we admit that the Democratic Republic of Congo does not exist? Now, this is at a time where it's probably, the state itself is probably much stronger than it has been in the last 30 years or so. But then the plonkers go on to say that there are no easy or quick solutions to this issue. So this leaves, of course, the rise of that brand of people to which the world will turn to resolve this issue. We show the next cartoon, which of course are the experts. The experts will be called out to give their opinions on the situation inside the DRC and inside of Africa itself. Thanks, you can take the cartoon down. So these things come together in a very, very dense example in events in South Africa recently. South Africa, as you all know, was built on mineral resources, access to mineral resources. I always say to my students, had it not been for the discovery of gold and diamond in South Africa, South Africa would have been a remoter place to the British Empire as Patagonia. Mining remains crucial in the South African economy. But as we now know, despite all the hype, it's a largely untransformed sector. We use this word in South Africa, transformation, which is a code word for the implementation of neoliberal economics. It's largely untransformed in any way at all. And a shooting in August 2012 at a town called Rustenburg, at a mining site in Marikana, killed 44 miners. They were shot by South Africa's police. This is the first time, listen to this, this is the first time in the country's history that police have shot striking miners. In the country's history. There was a case in the 1922 strike where the military shot white miners and bombed them, in fact, in the Witwatersrand area. But this is the first time in the country's history that this happened. So what are the issues? Firstly, the extraction of minerals in South Africa remains dependent on black labour, which is extremely badly paid. Secondly, it became clear after this, looking back on it, and there is a commission of inquiry into the issue, that these people were living in both the working and living conditions were, I guess, could politely be described as medieval. And let me give you a little example. There were literally no schools for the kids of miners. The mine owners, mine directors, in contrast, most of them were living in the Surrey Hills outside London, where I'm sure their kids were going to, is it Eton or Harrow, or whichever place you like to choose. The housing was extremely bad. Shocking. The situation was shocking. The police themselves were very poorly trained. And there was as is now emerging from the Commission of Inquiry, I don't want to second guess it, but it's now emerging from the Commission of Inquiry that they were hyped that day to go in and deliver the issue. It's also clear that the union movement is very badly fractured and divided between two central streams. One stream of the union movement is very close to the governing alliance, and the rise of a new union on the site had created the conditions for this to happen. What has essentially happened is that South Africa's social bargain is being threatened over the resource issue, over access to resources. And the question before us in the country is, can this be negotiated, renegotiated in some form or another? The pessimist in me says probably not, but I did live through the end of apartheid and prayed every night it would end, and so it came to pass. What I think is going on, it's really a struggle of mining in South Africa, as indeed elsewhere, for a social license to continue this particular operation. So South Africa is an optic, and an interesting optic, more than a case study, I think, to look at this issue. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Peter. Moving on, I'll turn to Sarah now. Now, to some extent, business is often overlooked in discussions about resource industries. While it's governments that regulate these industries and are often a site of political debates over how resource industry should operate, it's ultimately businesses that engage in extraction and processing and distribution of resources, and ultimately the decisions that get made within corporate structures as to determine a lot of the effects that these produce. Now, while the resource boom has recently driven high levels of investment, high prices, and in some companies, in some cases, high profits in the resource sector, A lot of people in Australia have recently started talking about a coming resources bust that might threaten a lot of this story, particularly around the world, and for those local in the audience, particularly in Western Australia. There's a small anecdote. I once did a talk on the resource boom on 6PR radio, which is a local talkback radio for those who know, and they opened up to the callers in the line, and I had someone ring up who was a plumber who said, "Hi, I'm Robbo from Joondalup, I'm a plumber, so should I be selling my house now?"
What did he say?
I said I just obfuscated. But this was my first and last experience of talkback radio, I can say. But sorry, to get to the question, how does the resource industry really think about the prospects for this resource boom we've seen over the last 10 or so years continuing into the future? And how does that really impact on the kind of decision making that we're seeing in the industry at the moment?
Thanks very much, Jeffrey, and thanks for having me here. I am going to focus most of my discussion around Western Australia because the Western Australian mines and energy industry is what I represent. And here we're not talking about a boom and bust. We don't think that language is appropriate for what we're seeing happening in Western Australia. What we're seeing is a sector undergoing transition. We're moving from a construction phase into an operation phase in Western Australia, and this is particularly the case for our bulk commodities, our LNG and our iron ore. What we've seen over the last decade has been major economic transformation in the commodities, across commodities like iron ore, LNG, coal and gold, and that has been brought about through the demand from our trading partners, so China, Korea, Japan, and at a lesser level India, but increasingly so. And it's been demand and price fluctuations which have really driven investment in resource projects in Australia. We've seen a massive investment which has led to this massive period of construction in Western Australia. We're now moving into operations. It's in the operation phase that projects will make their impact for decades to come. We're likely to see very significant increase in production levels in coming years, and this results in a greater economic benefit to the state through company tax and royalties. And it also results in returns to its shareholders, which benefits Australia broadly. A couple of numbers around that. For 2013, 2014, the Western Australian state government is anticipating collecting 21% of its budget from mining revenue. That's $5.3 billion in royalties and an extra $1.5 billion in other resource sector payments. So it's a very significant contribution to the wealth of this state. So the current challenge for the sector is around the high cost of doing business in Australia, and the volatile market dynamics, capital and labour productivity have become an increasing focus in ensuring the Western Australian resource projects' international competitiveness and ensuring that we continue to attract the international capital to fuel future investment. Again, there is some deceleration in investment, and that has, I think, sparked a lot of this conversation about boom versus bust. Again, it's not a fair representation of what's happening in Australia. We still have, by the Bureau of Resources and Energy Economics estimations, $141 billion of resource investment in committed projects. So there's a massive pipeline of projects still at record levels of investment in Australia. What we are seeing is that the costs are rising. We have declining ore grades in many of our commodities, and new minerals and energy-rich regions around the world are increasing the level of competition for the global capital which is required to fuel the resources sector in Western Australia. And I think it's important, we've been talking about emerging countries across the table here today, but Australia is losing its exploration competitiveness, and exploration is the heart of the future of the resources sector. If you look at the process that goes into turning a mine into an operating and resource generating entity, it starts off with an explorer kicking rocks, and Australia's share of global exploration is decreasing quite significantly, and a lot of the a lot of the perception is that this is to places like Africa where there's a different regulatory structure in place, but in fact we're losing our exploration share to places like Canada and the United States. So it's a very different set of circumstances that the resources sector is facing in Western Australia. The other thing that we need to bear in mind in Western Australia is that we don't have a monopoly on any of the resources that we produce. Our proportion of world iron ore is about 26%, world gas is about 6%, again 6% of the world's gold and 14% of the world's nickel. So Western Australia is in a competitive environment and facing those pressures that it comes, external pressures. The other thing that I just wanted to mention was that, there is also a sense, and you hear it in Australia from time to time, about foreigners owning Australian mines. The fact is that the resources industry is a global industry. The scale of the projects means that it competes for global international capital. And while the returns on this capital are due to the foreigners, the enterprises they support employ and pay Australian wages and Australian taxes, and foreign investments benefit the domestic economy by allowing higher levels of output. And you're really seeing that play out in Western Australia. When you talked about governance, it was really the stable macroeconomy, the political stability, regulatory frameworks that are conducive to foreign investment remain incredibly important for Australia and for continuing the benefits that we get from the resources sector. And one of the other factors that I think is really pressing for the resources industry in Western Australia and in Australia is the need for infrastructure. And so it's really social infrastructure and physical infrastructure. It is creating the schools and communities in remote areas where the mines are located to get the workforce there, to enable the resource extraction and to continue the economic growth. And it's this partnership on infrastructure which I think is at a really interesting juncture in Australia, Australia's economy at the moment, and it's the conversation about the sharing of risk and how we allocate risk and how we look at who's responsible for the infrastructure and how we pay for it. And I think the industry understands that it's part of that formulation, but it's not viable to suggest that it's only the industry that pays for the infrastructure that goes into building the economic growth for the nation. And I'll just finish up saying, at the moment, the resources sector in Western Australia employs around 103,000 people, and if you add resources-related construction and resources-related manufacturing jobs in Western Australia, you come to around 11% of the state's employment, over 142,000 people directly employed in mining and oil and gas. In last year, these resource extraction and services were the single largest sectoral contribution to the Western Australian economy, contributing $89 billion or 41% of the state's economy. Nationally, as Jeffrey mentioned, resources industry, extraction and services contributed $169 billion in value add to the Australian GDP, again about 11%, and about 3.8% of the national workforce is employed in the industry. So it's a very important industry for the growth of the nation, and ensuring that we create a regulatory environment which enables the investment and enables that sustainable development is incredibly important. I think I'll leave it at that.
And I'll finally turn our attention to Ronnie for our last small presentation this morning. Now, Ronnie, to some extent, the environment is somewhat like the dark side of the global resources boom. As we've seen demand for energy and minerals and food surge over the last few years, increasing productions put a lot of demands on ecological systems to support these activities. And we're getting to a point where the planet's ecological carrying capacity to tolerate these kinds of demands is getting very close to its limits, or, while I'm not a biologist, as some have suggested, it has already been exceeded. So my question is, to what extent are ecological limits to the kind of patterns of resource production and governance that we're seeing, how intense and binding are these constraints? And are we seeing any kind of evidence that some of the governance changes needed to ameliorate these constraints are going to be overcome in the future?
Well, I want to start by thanking conference organizers and the U.S. Consulate for making it possible for me to exceed my personal carbon budget and fly in. I think maybe I'm sort of a plonker here because I'm not in the sort of Herbst sense, but I'm going to talk in sort of broad, global international terms rather than in a kind of comparative politics sense. To me, the terms that have been used are all a little problematic. The first point is that resource booms are always almost followed by resource busts. And because the growth in global demand in the global south has been so dependent on global demand in the global north, where the economies are fairly stagnant, there is a real likelihood that we're going to start seeing all of this investment that's been done in response to the 2008 price spikes in particular start to saturate the market and cause not just because of the lack of demand, but prices are going to collapse. This happened in the 1980s. It's now happening in the United States with respect to natural gas because of fracking. And it points out that we let markets govern booms and busts, okay? And I think that's a really important point, which I want to come back to. The second thing I want to point out is that, let's see, what is the second thing I want to point out? Carrying capacity is a really difficult concept to operationalize. I mean, if you're talking about species within a kind of constrained territory, you can draw these logistic curves that show that as populations exceed the supply of food, something's got to give. Human beings, of course, have this marvelous capacity to move stuff around. And this is why we are now for the time being, the most successful species on the planet, barring cockroaches and rats, that we can move things around. Now, the thing is, of course, once again, we're letting markets determine how things are moved around, and inevitably, those things are being moved towards those who have money. And wealth is concentrated, let's just say, in a global middle and upper class of maybe 1.5 billion people. If you start to add the growing middle classes of Asia, you might get up to 2 billion. The point is that consumption is concentrated, is highly concentrated in a fraction of the global population. Again, it's the 25% consume the 75%, and the 75% get it in the neck, because all they get is 25%. Quite honestly, there is no reason to think this is going to change, notwithstanding Chinese investment, notwithstanding various kinds of international regulatory initiatives, because the investment is driven by demand, and the demand remains extremely dependent on that global middle class. And to the extent that Asia does not start to turn to internal development and internal stimulus, it's starting to happen, but it's still, I read constantly that things are starting to slow down or stagnate in China because the demand is not there in the global north. So ultimately, the poor are not going to really benefit from from these enormous resources. All kinds of nice, I'm being very cynical here, and I think I'm justified. All of the sort of aspirations towards transparency and democracy and things like that are going to remain largely aspirations. They're already vanishing in the global north. And so to say that somehow these are miraculously going to develop in the global south, I think is to ignore tendencies. The third thing that I want to, the third thing that I want to say is this whole question of environmental governance. Now, I worked on this stuff for a long time, and I was very optimistic about international diplomacy, negotiation with states, all this kind of stuff. I think that the annual conferences around global climate change basically indicate that global environmental diplomacy has failed. And again, it is because of the attempt to try and let markets govern environmental impacts. That is to say, because there is a real reluctance in politics, especially democratic politics, to bite the bullet of limiting energy consumption and resource consumption, which would require, in my estimation, the rise in the price of oil, a barrel of oil, from $100 to around $500 a barrel. You can imagine the political impacts of that. You just had an election here, which revolved, I understand, around emission permits to some degree, right? This is minor compared to what needs to be done. I'm not being Malthusian here, and I don't want to emulate Julian Simon. I just want to point out that markets have been allowed, as Professor Vail pointed out, have basically become the de facto mechanism for governance. And markets, unless they are very strongly regulated, follow a certain boom and bust logic. I mean, this is nothing new, and there's no reason again to think it's going to end. So, what's going to happen? Well, some 30 years ago, William Ophuls wrote a book in which he posited the necessity for a green leviathan, a global government that would somehow, either benignly or not, impose limits on growth, not limits to growth, limits on growth. Now, I think, the green leviathan is unrealistic, but I want to point to the possibilities of global regulation coming from non-democratic sources. And here I'm going to sort of veer off into what I've become really interested in. And that is the growing security economy surveillance network in which we are all enmeshed. I am sure that many of you have had the experience of going abroad and finding that your credit card has been turned off. And this is, of course, because you forgot to notify your credit card company that you were going abroad. And for your personal security, they've noticed a change in your charging patterns, and they've said, well, it's for their security as well. Well, we're not going to allow you to do anything with it, right? So we already see a way in which security and economy come together. Now, the NSA, of course, all the revelations from the Snowden leaks and from other things, the National Security Agency has, and I don't think this is any surprise. I found an article the other day about how it's also testing whether using credit card transactions, it can track people's behaviors and relationships and things like that to try and identify persons of interest. Well, in the future, I propose you're all going to be persons of interest. You're all part of the middle class. I am too. And the way in which global environmental regulation might come about is through these networks. Basically, limits will be put on what you can do. We can imagine continuous surveillance of our activities with intervention by what we can think of as a world state, but which isn't really a world state, to control or curtail those judged to be excessive or damaging to the global environment. You want to buy something? Sorry, not today. You want to travel to the International Studies Association in the United States? Sorry, you've used up your carbon quota for the next 5 years. How does a nice staycation at home sound? By the way, your house is too warm. Put on a sweater, because it'll be rather chilly for the next few weeks as smart energy grids start to be able to regulate what's going on in the house. There's a whole sort of thing that's developing here that, we sort of see the high points of it, but it's a much more subtle kind of form of regulation. And it's not exactly economic, and it's not exactly political, all right? It may come out of sheer necessity. I'm not thrilled by this idea, but it's starting to look, to me at least, that this may well be, if the environmental constraints become really serious, this may well be what we're in for. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ronnie. I think that was a very interesting and provocative point for us to end this discussion on so far of what's been some diverse and high-quality contributions from our discussants. But I guess now at the time, we're in about 25 minutes, so I'd like to open up to the floor for questions. I will ask, there's someone coming around with a microphone, which should be working if the AD is gods are being nice to us today. And I would ask, if you are going to ask a question, could you keep it brief and succinct so we get an opportunity for the panels to respond in some detail. And we might take a few at a time if we've got some. Sorry, could you? Yeah. And then probably all the way back there. That's right.
Thank you. Joan Staples from the University of New South Wales. Until we heard from you, Ronnie, I was experiencing a considerable disjunct because our distinguished president yesterday gave us a speech about the importance of climate change and how this massive, looming problem we have needed to be addressed by us as political scientists. So I was really pleased, thank you, Ronnie, that we did actually have climate change mentioned. What I would like to throw to the panel is, particularly with the obviously gunning resources boom, clearly gunning things such as coal output and burning of coal is a key issue. Ronnie's addressed it from the point of view of maybe some rather scary sort of security type conditioning in the future. But I'd like to throw it to the panel, what do you see in the next 10, 20, 30 years, particularly in the next 10, 20 years, that will be happening within the resources sector to govern the resources boom in relation to climate change?
We'll take a couple at a time, so Lou, do you want
Thank you. It seems to me that the fundamental issue here is the transnational nature of resource extraction and trading. The Chamber of Mines representative summed this up very well by saying, well, you can't regulate us too much, you can't tax us too much, because we're competing in a global market. And by the way, can the state please provide us with some infrastructure that we need? This is the threat that's made by transnational capital to all local jurisdictions. So it's clear that the resource boom cannot be governed at the national level. The things that Peter Vale highlights, the fact that the mining magnates of South Africa now live in the UK, is a result of the opening up of the South African economy after apartheid. So Anglo-American, the first thing they did is relocated to London. So how do we have transnational regulation? This is the difficulty, that with the rise of transnational capitalist class and capitalist enterprises and the demise of organised labour, the power of these transnational corporations is very difficult to think of a way to regulate it. The only proposal that we've had is this authoritarian one from Ronnie, where the state somehow, the national security state somehow, regulates our behaviour. To me, this is the reason why the public does not get behind environmental movements, because the solution always seems to be rein consumption, lower your living standards, and submit to authoritarian control of personal behaviour. Is there a way of tackling the power of transnational corporations, but also reconciling environmental protection with the need to raise living standards? What about that 75%? You can't simply ignore them. So what are the potential solutions? As the Oxfam rep said, these transnational voluntary governance systems don't have teeth. So where is the bite going to come from? It can't come from the national level. And we don't want it to come from the NSA. So where is it going to come from?
Would anyone like to? I'll give you a go right there.
Yeah, no, I think you know, I want you to understand that I don't favor what I was I mean, am I sure? I'm unfortunately, I think there's a certain logic that governs the development, the evolution of technological capacities and sort of human desires and all these kinds of things. But let me say something else. If and when transnational capital recognizes that it's in its own interest to submit to this kind of regulation, then we will get regulation. I just frankly don't see, I just don't see democratic states individually being willing to submit to those kinds to self-regulate just because of people want to consume more, they want higher living standards. I think we have an ethical obligation to ensure that the 75% do get higher living standards. And I think the problem is too low, their consumption is too low. But the flip side of that is that, for the rest of us, it's somehow redistribution has to occur. It's not going to occur, with ecological modernization and the idea that somehow technology is going to get us out of a problem that technology and markets have gotten us into. I just don't think that that's going to work. So I'm just going to be the professional pessimist and cynic on the panel, all right? Understand, I was once told that a cynic is a disillusioned idealist.
And I feel I should just answer the claim that the international mining is holding governments to ransom. That's certainly not the case in Australia. And I think it's one of a partnership, and it's understanding the long-term nature of a resource development. And the money that is being paid in Western Australia is a significant portion of what is contributing to the broader wealth of the state. The idea that the companies will not make a commercial decision unless they've got their last pound of flesh from the government, I don't think that's the case. I certainly don't see it in the negotiations and the conversations that I see. What I see in Australia is a conversation about sustainable and long-term mining to deliver a long-term growth and growing the pie that's available for all Australians and being part of that conversation. So I don't think of it as one of holding to ransom. I do think that the nature of international capital means that people will make choices about competitiveness, but part of that competitiveness comes from the social license to operate and the sustainability, and that stability and certainty of return that comes from knowing that the regulatory environment in which you're operating delivers you some certainty is a really important factor in that equation.
One more comment on that. And that is, I think that's exactly partly the point, is that the regulation of return, of a reasonable return, and as well as the regulation of prices and output is really, if you want to end the boom and bust cycle, you have to talk about serious intervention into markets. And the problem is nobody wants to do that because, again, it's politically very, in the United States, it's death to talk about that. And so, again, I don't see that happening. But I mean, certainly, I'm all for certainty and stability if it contributes as well to the addressing of social, economic, and environmental questions. I just don't see where it's going to come from. Sorry.
Well, the question that's just been posed, that's what keeps Oxfam in business. How can we engage and better understand the impact of transnational operations, amongst other things? Now, I guess in terms of a couple of three responses, I would say. One is increasingly we think it's really important to understand the idea of beneficial ownership of transnational organisations. We need to understand where their parent company sits, how their business structures are put in place. So that sort of knowledge then enables us to ensure that if it is a transnational or multinational organisation that's operating in a weak governance country where they may be upholding national laws, but they may be quite weak laws there, through understanding the beneficial ownership and the parent company structure, we can then also use mechanisms in home countries to hold those countries to account. So there is a role and responsibility for government of home countries to get involved. Secondly, I'd say the other answer to regulating transnational corporations will increasingly come from poor citizens in resource-rich countries who will increasingly just get jack of the sorts of things that they're seeing. Now, we've heard about Marikana, and just also, for example, if we take Mozambique, large thousands of people who've been resettled around the Rio Tinto and Vale sites to land that is in fact infertile. They're not able to grow crops, and they're holding up the railway line. They're blocking the railway line to stop production. So there will be increasing unrest. And so for us, the importance of ensuring that citizens understand the revenue flows, that gives them information to hold their own governments and indeed transnational corporations to account. And the third point I want to make is how we're going to regulate this. And this is really from the new best friend of the international NGO movement, and that is investors. Investors have become the champion of some of the work we're doing around disclosure, transparency and accountability. And they do have the capacity to influence the market. They do have the capacity to put some levers there because they want to understand risk. And just by way of example, in the last month, a group of 44 international investors representing more than 5.6 trillion in assets under management has written to the chairman of the US Securities and Exchange Commission voicing its support for the Dodd-Frank legislation, which includes the issue around disclosure of all payments to governments by oil, gas and mining sectors. So we see the role of investors really playing out and increasingly becoming a very powerful force in regulating transnational activity. Not because they necessarily have woken up and they're good human rights activists or anything like that, but they want stable economic operating environments and they want to better understand risk. And they know that in the current extractive sector with booming prices, there is a huge appetite for risk in the industry. Political risk, geographic risk and technical risk. And we're seeing that play out and investors stepping in more and more.
Let me just throw a few ideas out. I mean, on the first issue of governing climate change, one of the complications, of course, is that this is always played out in a highly technical language. And if accessing these conventions is very difficult because of this highly technical language. And so I think the NGOs have a role to play here in making this language much more accessible to people so that these conversations can go on. But the short answer is I'm not very optimistic that African governments, particularly mine, will take this issue seriously. On the second point, I mean, I'm very old-fashioned in this. I think education is absolutely critical. And this links with what the President said yesterday. I mean, I think that there needs to be a movement inside universities, however difficult that is, to return to liberal arts education, where students in the sciences and the arts and the humanities study together in the sense of trying to understand these big world issues. And, I think all of us have a responsibility to try and bring this form of education back. I mean, ironically, it's the kind of education all of us enjoy, and we've kind of moved away from it in such a drastic way. The third point I'd make is Norway is a very interesting test case over this issue. Here is a government which is partially socialist, the social democratic. Here is the test of this immediate election on what's going to happen. But here is a group of people who are extraordinarily rich. They have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. And I spend sort of 3 months every year in Norway. It seems to me that there is a real movement in that country now to ensure that the sovereign wealth fund pays taxes outside of these tax havens. So I think Norway is an interesting example. It's an example people should follow much more closely. You know, there are 4 million of them living there. They're talking this strange language, walking up and down hills. And they're really concerned about the environment, although they're making so much money out of it. So it's an interesting example.
I think we have a question from Lady.
I guess my question to the panel gets at what perhaps prefigures the possibility of a transnational set of relationships around governing resources, and that is the nature of the states in which these resources are being extracted. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that, you know, in the Australian case and in a number of other cases enjoying the benefits of the resources boom, these are settler colonial states, and the land from which these resources are being extracted is indigenous land. And we proceed with these conversations as though those questions are settled, and they fundamentally remain unsettled. Politically, ethically, morally, I think this is a persistent challenge. The case is slightly different in South Africa, where the politics of indigeneity is more complex. But, you know, in Latin America, certainly in Australia, in Canada, to some extent in the US, these are very live and I think critical questions that I think as political scientists we, you know, I think we'd be irresponsible to not try and include that in our conversation this morning.
I've got Andrew.
Andrew O'Neill, Griffith University. Thanks for the presentations. I want to ask Sean Breslin a question, particularly about, sort of follows on from your conference in Beijing, and I'd be interested in your perceptions of the Chinese government's response and whether they have an integrated strategic response to a lot of the pushback they're now experiencing in places like Gabon, Niger, Chad, from the governments there that are seeking to reclaim their authority over mainly extractive kind of rights and so on, but to drive a lot harder bargains in the negotiations with Beijing. Now, I suspect in response partly to grassroots pressures that they've been ripped off by the Chinese in these areas. So I'd be interested in you know, your perception of how the Chinese government is responding to that.
I'll just take one more from this one from the lady over the front here.
A question for Serena. Serena, you mentioned that where women are involved in decision making about the governance of resources projects, there's more likely to be an emphasis on the longer term, which sounds very heartening. But I guess that involves the empowering of the powers. I wondered if you had any practical examples of where women have actually been at that table, how they got there, and what difference it made.
Just while Serena, you collect your thoughts on that, Sean, throw it to you for Andrew's question to start.
Well, there was a very specific one about pushback in Africa, and I think you can say there's probably 3 responses. One is to say it's not fair. It's very interesting. You talk to particularly international relations people in China, and they say, "But what can we do about it? It's not the Chinese state. It's individual companies or it's firms. They're not controllable. Why are we being treated badly for the?" Now, this is quite interesting and ironic, given that the Chinese state has consistently for years treated countries because of what individuals related to that country have done. Somebody attacks the torch in Paris and Carrefour gets boycotted. So that's one element of it, is particularly the people in the diplomatic agencies, they try and sort of push back and say, calm things down, but they can't they throw their hands up in exasperation. But a second thing that I think we have seen, and I did mention this briefly, is I think there has been an effort by the leadership to do more traditional aid, as it were. They've stepped up the schools and education and health to try and offset some of these ideas that it's just a rapacious state that's coming in and acid stripping and then getting out again. So I think there's a sort of a two-way. And a third, of course, is stepping up the diplomacy. I mean, if you're in Beijing any day of the week, you will see a visiting African delegation that are treated extremely well. So they're going at that elite level, not necessarily down onto. Can I just say one thing about climate change and before? I mean, most new treaties and governance structures come into play after the last one has failed to prevent a catastrophe. I mean, if we go through history, that tends to be the case. And in terms of climate change, I think the best thing that's happened in the Chinese context for a long time is that the pollution got so bad that people started getting really quite ill over the last winter. I mean, that might sound horrid, but it has immediately led to attempts to change things and do something about it. But I do fear that things are only going to happen when either companies start losing money because of it, or people start dying in large numbers because of it. And one final thing is that, isn't it interesting that when we talk about the environment, it's 20 years since the Human Development Report next year, and if you look at the definition there of environmental security, it goes into a whole range of things, but it's been totally captured by climate change debates, which are very different from the fact that you've got no water, or the fact that you have got water but you can't drink it because it's poisoned, or your house and your family have been demolished because the hill has slid away. And I'm not sure what the solution is, but it's really interesting that we seem to become captured by this transnational climate change issue, where many of the original things that the Human Development Report were pointed to were local and very dealable with by local interests and local governments, and not necessarily by transnational arrangements.
Sorry, would you like to respond to the question?
Sure. Well, certainly, thanks for the question, and clearly the extractive industry is not gender neutral. That's one thing that we well and truly have a good understanding of. And I think the response is probably a bit of a gloomy response. We haven't seen a lot of examples of where it works well in actually getting women to the table to be part of the negotiation process. One of the things that we're working on at the moment is a project in Papua New Guinea, in the CPIC region, where we're running and working with local women's groups, as well as local and small NGOs, to try and build the capacity of the community, including women, and both separately and with men, around understanding, for example, the right to free, prior and informed consent, which goes to the question around Indigenous people's rights. And even when we run those training programs and those community-based programs, it's extremely difficult for us to even get women to be accepted to be part of that program. Or if they do come, you find that all the men are in the hut and the women are standing outside or preparing the food. So we really struggle ourselves to even address that issue in our own work when we're working in country. So you can imagine how difficult and daunting it then is to set up processes for women to negotiate directly with mining companies or their own government. So one way we've tried to tackle that is we've actually developed a tool for the extractive industry on what is the gender impact of mining, because often there's not always a recognition or an understanding that it's not gender neutral. And so we've developed a tool for the industry on how to actually undertake a gender impact assessment as part of their normal sort of social impact assessment work. And it sort of goes through a process of identifying the tasks that women do in the community and the tasks that men do, and sort of valuing those, and then trying to understand what the impact will be on women and their role in society if, for example, their land's gone and they're no longer able to farm and fulfil that role of that important role of provider of food in their communities. So it's a pretty gloomy story with not a lot of great standout examples, but we're sort of tackling it from both ends, both supporting local organisations on the ground, and providing tools for the industry to help them understand the gender impact. And if I could just add one more comment in regards to the question about the rights of Indigenous peoples. Out the front you'll see this new report that we've just launched earlier this year called The Right to Decide, where we partnered with an investor analyst organisation and we did an assessment of the top 200 ASX listed extractives companies, of which there are 54. And of those 54 companies, only one Australian company had a policy in the public domain that recognised the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free, prior and informed consent. So that's a critical part of the work that we do, and this report that's at the front gives you a breakdown of all of those companies and who have policies in the public domain about. Some have Indigenous peoples policies, but only one company actually went as far to recognise the right of Indigenous peoples to free, prior and informed consent.
Now, cognizant of the time and the agenda for the conference, I will need to call the discussion to a close at the moment, but I'd like to thank our panellists for coming and speaking with us today, some from a very long way. I think this has been quite Morning to you.